Chapter 9, Gideon's Diplomacy. From Judges chapter 7, verse 23 through chapter 8, verse 1 through 6. Out of the confusion and carnage of the enemy camp this historic night, Yahuah, the Elohim of Yasharel, was bringing a tremendous triumph. It was every bit as great as a victory for his people as had been the overthrow of the Egyptians at the Red Sea, or the downfall of Jericho under Yahush's army. Again, Yahuah was demonstrating his amazing ability to deliver his own from the oppressor. The rout of the Midians at Marah was much more than just a tactical military triumph for Gideon's famous 300. It was also an enormous spiritual renewal for all of this downtrodden, woebegone, broken nation of Yasharel. Even the most obtuse Yashreelite would realize at once that here the great army of his Elohim had been made manifest. Here he saw clearly that the hand of Yahuah had intervened on behalf of his chosen ones. It was this fact, perhaps more than any other, which swept through the towns, villages, farms, and strongholds of Manasseh, Naphtali, and Asher. Like a raging brush fire, the news of the night fanned across the country. Armed men tumbled out of their humble homes and hamlets to join the hue and cry after the fleeing enemy forces. Hounds hot on the trail, they pursued their oppressors, cutting them down as they fled eastward towards the Jordan. The Yashreelite warriors were no longer the timid men whom Gideon had sent home the day before. They were not the reluctant, unsure soldiers who had chosen to turn tail rather than attack the invaders. The events of this momentous night had injected them with an overwhelming sense of superiority against enormous odds. Even though thousands of Midianite, Amalekites, and Bedouin had butchered each other in the bedlam of their confusion, uncounted other thousands had fled for the Jordan fords. Whenever they passed a Yashreelite farm or village in their flight, the residents would pour out to pursue them mercilessly. Terror-stricken, the Midianites were shot through with arrows, pierced with spears, and slashed with swords. Shouts of triumph went up on every side, echoing across the valley and hills, ringing from the rocks, rousing all of Yasharel. In that one terrible day, some 120,000 enemy troops were slaughtered. It was an appalling loss of life of gigantic proportions. Even during some of the greatest engagements in World War II, there were not this many casualties in any single day. Despite the ferocious bombings by military aircraft, the use of high-powered artillery and tanks, the enormous firepower of machine guns, mortars, and bazookas, fewer men ever fell in combat in any one 24-hour battle than were cut down under Gideon's savage attack. Perhaps in all of this, the most miraculous part was the manner in which men of war, who so shortly before had been so abruptly rejected by this novice commander, would again rally to his call. Obviously, this was no ordinary human response. Normally, their reply would have been to turn from him in disdain with the cutting comment, "If you're such a great general, go ahead and fight your own war." Instead, a spirit of wholehearted, vigorous cooperation gripped Gideon's countrymen. This, too, was part of the inspired work of Yahuah's Ruach. It was he who gave the entire people a single mind to win. Momentarily, at least, their family feuds, clannish quarrels, and intertribal rivalries were forgotten in the brutal battle. Their petty differences were submerged in the exciting chase across the country. Gideon had presented his people with an enormous and staggering challenge under Yahuah, and to their credit, it must be said, they rose to meet the challenge magnificently. There was before them the opportunity for greatness, and they grabbed it. In all of this, Gideon demonstrated unusual insight. He did not rely on just his own tiny handful of men to do the job. He was not so self-centered or proud that he tried to hug this great achievement to himself. He was a big man, a giant of a man, generous enough and favorous enough to call others to share in the spoils and conquest. He even sent runners into the hill country of Ephraim. That bold, powerful, arrogant tribe of the mountain country had always held the other tribes in contempt. Had Gideon invited them to come under his command from the outset, they would have spat in the dust with contempt and laughed in his face. Follow a farmer from Manasseh? What a joke! Who is Gideon anyway? Where does he come from? Ophrah is nothing, a dusty, dried-up, wind-blown bit of barren wasteland. Thousands of years later, when one greater than Gideon was to appear on Yasharel's center stage of action, there would be similar insults. Nazareth? That crude, contemptible community in Galilee? Could anything right come out of Nazareth? But Gideon, like our Messiah, was not to be dismayed. And when his request for help in the pursuit of the enemy reached Ephraim, they too responded with alacrity. As one man, they turned out in full force. Raging full speed down out of their mountain country, they carried out a swift encircling movement on the Midianites. In military terminology, it was a pincer action. It cut off the enemy's escape route by the way of the southern fords across the Jordan. The result was the annihilation of hordes of the desert warriors. It had been a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was executed with expertise and dispatch. All of Ephraim's famous fighters had flung themselves into the fray fearlessly. The upshot was that two of the top-flight princes of Midian were captured and slain, Oreb the raven and Zeb the wolf. These were the sort of names common to the desert tribes. They resembled the titles taken so often by our North American Indians and other tribes who live by the hunt. Oreb the raven had fled for refuge to a great high outcrop of rock where he was killed. Ever after the spot was called the Rock of the Raven. Zeb the wolf, on the other hand, had gone underground. Like his now famous opponent Gideon, who had first found refuge in a winepress, Zeb also tried to do the same and was slaughtered in the pit. So, from then on, that place bore the name of the winepress of the wolf. As it was customary in battle, both of the warrior princes were beheaded. Their plumed and ornamented heads, bejeweled with golden earrings dangling, were borne in bloody pride to Gideon. No greater proof could be provided of Ephraim's prowess in war. Ephraim was not a tribe to take a backseat to anyone in battle. She would show the world who could most fiercely swing a sword. She would let Gideon know this was not just his show. Though it was a day of titanic events and magnificent triumph for Yasharel, it was also an hour of critical uncertainty. It has been well said that not many men can stand success. Too often, it goes to their head. The aura of esteem and acclaim undoes them. Their little egos are inflated like a thin-walled bubble shining in the sun, about to burst with its own growing grandeur. Had Gideon been less of a real general, certainly at this point in his career, might readily have collapsed. For, despite the overwhelming victory granted to him by Yahuah, the old ugly rivalry with Ephraim raised its grim head again. The venom running dark in the veins of human nature must ever be an absolute abhorrence to Yahuah. It was not enough that he had given Yasharel such success. It was not enough that the cruel iron yoke of Midian should have been broken from their necks. It was not enough that Yahuah should have given Yasharel her freedom once again. They still had to grumble and find fault with Gideon. Why didn't you include us in your initial battle plans against the enemy? Why didn't you invite us to share in the action?" Their eyes flashed angrily. Somehow, this proud and haughty tribe could never be satisfied. No matter what a man did, it would be wrong. Had Gideon called them, they would have felt insulted. And now, because he hadn't, they were miffed. It was a devastating commentary on human behavior. And it would take the integrity and wisdom of Yahuah to pacify such proud and petulant people. But the Ruach of Yahuah had permeated all of Gideon's personality. He had the mind of Yahuah. He did not allow his emotions to control his conduct in this cruel crisis. Just one wrong gesture, one wrong move, one wrong word, and he could well precipitate a bloody civil conflict between his own men of Manasseh and Ephraim's hot-headed warriors. Looking at the blood-blackened heads of Oreb and Zeb, Gideon spoke with incredible tact. His words fell upon the hot, flaming emotions of his hearers, like a summer shower falling upon heated soil and hot rocks. What I have done to compare with your classic conquest and capture of the notorious raven and wolf? There are heads in your hands. All eyes turned to focus on the warrior skulls, surrounded by hovering swarms of flies drawn by the black blood. Yahuah has granted you a wondrous victory. Greater is your triumph than mine. It may seem to you not much more than a final gleaning of the grapes, but even then it far surpasses the finest wine that a country fellow from dusty Abizar could ever provide. It was a master of diplomacy. At a stroke, it disarmed the arrogant men of Ephraim. Their arguments were gone, blown away in the wind of Gideon's right will. In gentle right nature, humor, humility had diffused an explosive confrontation. He had proved himself a peacemaker. He was indeed a son of Yahuah. See Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. In this action, Gideon had demonstrated his reliance upon Yahuah to resolve a very complex conflict. He had found wisdom far beyond his own to pacify his brothers. It was an achievement in the moral realm equal to his remarkable accomplishments in the military field. Yahuah had indeed found a giant among men, but his greatness lay not in his own native genius, but rather in his simple trust in Yahuah. Appeased and placated, the men of Ephraim dropped the dispute. They had done their bit in the battle and done it well. Gideon recognized and appreciated their part in the fray. They were satisfied, and so was he. All was well between them. There would be peace now for years to come. In fact, for 40. If a Nobel Peace Prize had been awarded in 1256 BC, Gideon would have been the obvious nominee for the honor. But Gideon was not content to rest on his laurels. A remnant of the Midianites had managed to make right their escape across the Jordan River. About 15,000 ragtag ruffians had either waded or swam across the muddy stream, now low because of the late summer drought. Gideon was not content to let them slip away from his sword. They were led by two courageous desert chiefs, Zebah and Zalmunna. Cunning and crafty as two hunted hawks, the cruel, haughty warriors were determined to elude Gideon in their desert waste. Gideon was not about to give in. He and his gallant 300 crossed the Jordan. Its cool waters refreshed their hot, tired bodies and aching limbs. They had all been on the go steadily since before midnight the day before. Passing through the murky water, the men lapped it up hurriedly like hounds hot in the hunt, pursuing their prey. They were unrelenting. There was no slowing down. The Midianites would be brought to bay. Yet, as they pushed on into the sun-blasted hills across the Jordan, their stomachs were pinched with hunger pangs. All day, They had been without food of any sort to fortify their famished bodies. They were growing weak and faint with gnawing hunger. Suddenly, they stumbled into a little settlement called Succoth. Here, surely, they would find supplies to refresh them. Surely, the people of Succoth would share some bread and meat with Gideon's half-starved troops. After all, they were distantly related, and one did not turn away from those in need in time of war, especially so when men had shown such heroism in battle, such determination against impossible odds. The residents of Succoth were really not impressed by Gideon. Despite his great victory over Midian already, despite his unrelenting pursuit of the Midianite remnant, despite his enormous perseverance in the face of overwhelming obstacles, despite all of his entreaties, they took a neutral stand. After all, you haven't yet captured Zebah and Zalmunna, they taunted him sarcastically. We will simply play it safe. We will wait and see what really happens. It may seem to us an absurd position for this little nondescript community to have taken. The people of Succoth were a splinter offshoot from Ephraim. They had deserted their own mountain tribesmen and crossed into the desert waste beyond the Jordan. There they subsisted at a low level, barely eking out a precarious existence at the mercy of the Midianites who despised them. They were known as those of no name, and it might well be added of no loyalty. Like so many people in the world, they were fence-sitters. They would not be loyal to anyone. They sought the best of both worlds, but fell between the two. The strength, stamina, and spiritual drive of Gideon was not for them. They would not align themselves with the enemy either. By their own choosing, they had become speckled birds. As with all such catastrophic choices in life, in the end, it would spell their utter undoing. As a man sows, so shall he reap. Their final end would be a shameful calamity. Chapter 10. Gideon's Perseverance. From Judges, chapter 8, verse 16 through 13. The negative reaction from Succoth to Gideon's request for refreshments would have daunted some lesser men, but not Gideon. Even though at this point he and his men were battle-weary, famished, and fatigued. He was a commander strong in Yahuah. His confidence lay not in the unpredictable nature of men, but in the remarkable reliability of Yahuah to sustain and empower him. Repeatedly, his requests for reinforcements from his fellow Yashreelites had met with an immediate positive response. All sorts of men, with little or no battle training, had rallied around him. They had risen to meet his blood-stirring challenges. Ferociously that day, they had flung themselves into combat. They came from his own clan, from Asher, Naphtali, all of Manasseh, and even Ephraim. But when Gideon asked no more than a bit of bread and a drink from Succoth, then later Penuel, he was derided for even daring to do so. Almost in derision, they taunted him. Have you come with the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in yours? Why, you haven't even overtaken these fierce warriors. Yet you ask us to supply you with bread as though you were already victorious? It was a two-pronged put-down. First of all, it had paid indirect homage to the prowess of the wild desert chieftains who had pillaged Palestine for several dreadful years. Second, it was a slur and insult to the gallantry of Gideon. Beyond both of these, however, was the indisputable fact that the residents of both Succoth and Penuel had no confidence at all in the Yahuah of Yasharel. Long since, they had deliberately separated themselves from their fellow countrymen. With calculating intent, they had moved into enemy territory across the Jordan, and there, in a double-minded way, they lived uneasily in the wilderness with divided loyalties and affections. They were neither truly among Yahuah's own chosen people, nor really allied wholeheartedly with their fierce adversaries. They were neither really hot nor cold. Like shriveled stalks of sun-bleached grass, they bent to the winds of circumstance, no matter which way they blew. They were forever trying to play it safe and cozy to accommodate themselves. For a man with tremendous thrust of Gideon, such softness and pussyfooting was nauseating. He could not stomach such duplicity and indecision. His response to Succoth's syrupy stand was that when he returned from the desert in victory, he would have to discipline this community with startling severity. Likewise, to Penuel, he made it very clear that the strong tower in which their confidence reposed would be razed, leaving them vulnerable. It was a tough lesson they would need to be taught. Their strength lay not in man-made structures of stone, bricks, or beams, but in Yahuah. Gideon's ferocious treatment of these Halloway people was not to be some personal, vindictive action. He was not a little man out to even the score with those who scorned him. He was not just getting back at those who belittled him. He simply saw himself as an instrument of justice and judgment in the hands of Yahuah. He was just as willing to be the one used to cut down and tear away the duplicity and double-dealing of these disloyal Yashreelites as he had been to tear down and demolish the altar and grove of the false Elohim and Yasharel. It would be harsh treatment that Succoth and Penuel would receive. Gideon did not indulge himself with mere idle threats. He was a man of action. What he said, he did. He may have had other weaknesses in his makeup, but indecision was not one of them. He had met Yahuah. He had seen Yahuah move in majestic power on his behalf. So there was no stopping him now in his advance against the enemy. Unless one has lived in these Middle Eastern countries and is familiar with their culture, many of the incidents recounted in the history of Yasharel may seem to us terribly crude and cruel. Unfortunately, very often, the ruthless treatment and spine-chilling atrocities carried out have been misconstrued as coming from a heavenly edict. This simply is not so. Just as in the case of modern warfare, where masses of innocent victims have suffered under atomic bombs, incendiary bombs, napalm bombs, or even gas or germ warfare, no one can say these lethal weapons are of Yahuah's design. They are the product of a perverted humanity which refuses to accept or acknowledge the rule and conduct of a righteous Yahuah. There is inherent in the basing ongoing of the cosmos certain irrevocable principles. These have been Yahuah ordained, and anyone who contravenes them does so at his own enormous peril. This explains why human societies, which deliberately ignore or spurn the righteousness of our favorite Yahuah, are so merciless and cruel. In Gideon's day, and even in our times, in some Muslim countries, it was not uncommon to cut off a man's hands if he was found stealing. For the remainder of his wretched life, the poor victim would be compelled to beg for a living. His severed stumps would be an enduring reminder, both to him and his community, that there was an appalling penalty to pay for thievery. By the same measure, a woman taken in adultery was smashed to a pulp by her neighbors outside the village walls. Women just did not dare to indulge in illicit sexual relationships. A man who committed rape was thrust through with spears and swords. His blood was spilt in the main town square where it stained the stones. Its black and almost indelible stain was a grim reminder to any would-be rapist that such activity could cost him his life. And for disloyalty to his people in time of war, a man's back could be torn and lacerated using the cruel thorn branches of the desert acacia for a lash. These fierce and fearsome forms of brutality were woven into the warp and woof of their ferocious lives. We need to remind ourselves that the ongoing history of the human family has been a story stained by blood and carnage. Yet, into this appalling picture of suffering comes the compassion and concern of our Yahuah, who cares deeply for the awful dilemma of his earth children. Always, he is endeavoring in any way possible to turn us from the perverseness of our paths and the wickedness of our ways. He sends his own appointed servants to discipline, direct, and draw us back to his precepts. Those he loves and cares about, he disciplines. In Yahuah's great right hand, Gideon was to become a scourge to Succoth and Penuel. He was the one chosen to correct their wrongdoing. It was he who would have to bear the brunt of the blame for bearing down on them so hard when he returned from battle. Succoth and Penuel were both places which had special significance for Yasharel. They were not just nondescript villages out in the wilderness. Rather, they were tied in strongly to the very ancient traditions of this nation. It was at Penuel where Yaakov had met and wrestled with the Melech of Yahuah. It was there, alone, in the darkness of that fierce contest, that Yaakov, the supplanter, became known as Yasharel, a prince with Yahuah. He, who had been such a double dealer, had at last come clean to become a champion and patriarch of his people. The men of Penuel knew this. It was a heroic tradition with them. Yet, here, they themselves had slipped back into the ignominious traits of their traditional hero. Succoth was almost as much at fault. It was called the Place of the Booths, in memory of the fact that here Yaakov, or Yasharel, had made camp with his family just before meeting Esau. His reconciliation with his brother, whom he had so grievously defrauded of his birthright, had been a masterstroke of statesmanship. So both Succoth and Penuel were places with a proud and noble tradition. But tradition itself was not enough to preserve a people from peril. They were communities with a great name, but those names had come to be no name because of their compromise. All of this, Gideon, as Yahuah's man of the hour, was determined to correct. But first, there was one more battle to be fought and a final conquest to be consummated. Relentlessly, Gideon pushed on out into the terrible heat and blazing sun of the Transjordan deserts. Only a general of enormous charisma and command would be followed by his band of 300 into such horrendous hardship. Here, daytime temperatures hovered around 120 degrees. The heat is appalling, burning, scorching, shriveling men in its terrible intensity. Heat waves shimmer above the hot stones and sand. The brilliant, ghastly, intense sunlight sears the eyeballs, scorches the skin, desiccates the body with its brutal burning. The best of men are benumbered by the awesome torment of terrible thirst and grim lassitude that grips them as in a vicious vice. But Gideon would not give way. He pushed on relentlessly. With a stroke of great genius, he led his men in a wide circle far out to the east of Karkor. This outpost of the enemy was where Zebah and Zalmunna had encamped after their escape across the Jordan. Their old, cocky self-confidence had come back to the two desert chiefs. They were so sure of themselves in these dry desert wastes. Here, they were on home territory. Here, they had the distinct advantage of familiarity with this formidable terrain. Settling in comfortably with their remaining forces of some 15,000 fighters, they were sure no Yasharelite would ever dare to attack them in this stronghold. They really did not know Gideon. They had underrated the unshakable courage of this young commander. They were to be taken by utter surprise a second time. Their attacker would come at them from a totally unexpected quarter, from the eastern desert. Again, the odds against Gideon were overwhelming. Here he was with a small, tired, hungry band of 300 thirsty men attacking a force of 15,000 desert warriors. Yet he and his men were inflamed with victory. They were thirsting for one last mighty triumph. Even if the odds were against them were 50-1, they would win. Yahuah was with them. Yahuah was their king. Sweeping down on Karkor from the east, Gideon cut the enemy host to shreds before they could collect themselves from their comfortable composure. The Yashreelites were fierce as desert falcons, stooping to the kill. That day, Karkor lived up to its name, the place of battering down. There, Yahuah granted Gideon his second great conquest. There, Gideon again lived up to his name, the cutter down. It was an hour of great esteem. The Midianites fled and scattered. They were driven hither and thither like dust before the wind. Overwhelmed with terror, they were slaughtered in their tracks. Their bodies littered the dry ridges and dongas. By night, jackals would scavenge their carcasses. By day, the vultures would pick their bones, and for 40 years, their fierce war shouts would be stilled across the waste. Zebah, the sacrifice, and his comrades in arms, Zalmunna, no shade or shelter, tried to escape but were captured in mid-flight. It was a tremendous exploit for Gideon's men. Their victims would know what it was to taste the sword, to see themselves as human sacrifices, to know there was no place to turn now for shade or shelter from the fierceness of their formidable foe. For Gideon, this was the moment of ultimate triumph. This was the moment of truth. This was the final confirmation of Yahuah's word to him in Ophrah under the old gnarled oak. I will be with you and smite the Midians as one man. But for Gideon, there was much more than the vindication of his faith in Yahuah. Great as that had been, there was also here the enormous double barracoat of discovering that his Yahuah was also the Yahuah of rich and wondrous compensation to his people. He had been so willing to give honor and precedent to Ephraim for capturing Oreb and Zeb earlier in the battle. Now there had fallen into his own hands Zebah and Zalmunna, equally notorious desert hawks. This was as great as an accolade as any he had bestowed on his comrades in arms. So there he stood now, supreme in his prestige as the outright, undisputed leader of his nation. This is ever the way with Yahuah. He honors those who honor him. He is ever active in raising up to great heights those who humbly walk with him. He is Yahuah. Yahuah not only of all consolation, but also the Yahuah of all compensation. It is he who lifts one man up and sets another down. It is he who guarantees that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. These were and are eternal principles that he has determined should function in the affairs of men. And it is a wise and prudent person who walks humbly before him, reveling quietly in his heavenly companionship. With this great battle behind him, Gideon and his now illustrious 300 took a break. It was time to slack their thirst, assuage their hunger, and refresh their weary bodies. There are few records in history anywhere of so few valiant warriors having conquered so many of the enemy with so little equipment. When they returned from the eastern desert, it was by way of the high, rugged mountain pass of Heres. In our idiom, this would be known as the Pass of the Sun. In their triumphant train marched the two shackled warrior chieftains, They were the supreme trophies of war, whom Gideon brought back as final and irrefutable proof of his conquest under Yahuah. It was no woebegone band of men who marched with him. Rather, they were troops flush with victory and the honor of their Yahuah.